Chapter 7. The Fine Straw Hat. "Now, old man, now? Have you thought of anything yet?" Chico lowered the gourd full of black coffee from his mouth and looked at the old man hopefully. Grandfather waved his smoking pipe. Not yet, give me time," he grumbled. Ever since last night, Chico had been asking the same questions. How could a man think when he was pestered so? Why, even in the middle of the night, the boy had wakened to ask again. And now, the first thing in the morning, before a man's brains were warm enough to move at all, he was at it again. The old man sucked on his pipe and stared at the fire. The house was silent. Outdoors, the blue sky was covered with thick masses of clouds, purple-black and heavy with rain. Soon there would be a storm. As Grandfather thought, he would nod his head. Chico would watch him. When he would shake it as if to say, "No, that will not do," Chico would sigh unhappily. At last, the old man nodded 2 or 3 times. He straightened up on the stool and slapped his thin leg with one hand. "That is it!" he exclaimed. "What is it, viejito? Have you an idea?" Chico stood up excitedly. See, but it is not easy. It will take time," warned the old man. "What is it?" Grandfather paused and looked importantly at the boy. "We will weave a hat, or rather you will," he answered. "Oh!" All the air blew out of Chico's lungs. He had believed that Grandfather had thought of something. But hat weaving? They had been doing that for years, and still they had no money. "Do not make such a face, my boy. This is different. How much do we get for a hat?" Chico sat down in discouragement. 2 sucres, sometimes 3 if I am careful," he answered hopelessly. "Well then, this time we will weave a hat that is worth—" The old man paused and waited for the boy to look at him. "That is worth 50 sucres. 50 sucres? Chico had never seen so much money in his whole life. 50 sucres for just one Panama hat, Grandfather? Who would be crazy enough to pay that much? Aha! That is how much you know. Have I not always told you that you have much to learn yet?" He chuckled. "No, Chico, they would not be crazy. You see, there are other hats than the kind you have woven. Those are quickly made of coarse straw. But there is another kind which only a few people know how to weave. They are so fine and beautiful that any buyer is willing to pay that much money and more. This kind," the old man went on proudly, "is made by only a few families. The skill is handed down from father to son and mother to daughter, and my own family was one of these. Once they wove the finest in the Provincia de Azuay." Chico looked carefully at the old man. What he said sounded true, but then, why had he not woven good hats before? The boy's eyes stared at the old man's hands. The skin on them was black and tough from years of digging in the cold Paramos earth. The knuckles were swollen, and some of the fingers were twisted out of shape. It was hard for the old man to weave the cheap hats. How could he make a finely woven one? Grandfather followed the boy's glance. He stretched one hand in front of him and bent the stiff fingers back and forth awkwardly. "Yes," he said sadly, "it is true. My fingers are too old now, but I have the secret of weaving them here." He tapped his forehead with one finger. "And your fingers are young. If you work hard and do just as I say, you may be able to make a good hat. When it is done, you can go to Cuenca and sell it." The old man paused and looked at Chico very thoughtfully. Then with a sigh he continued, "But perhaps you will not be able to make a fine one. It has always been true that one must be born into a hat-weaving family to have the knack." Chico was convinced. Once more he jumped up from his stool. If Grandfather would teach him, he knew he could weave the hat. Of course, he had not done well on the cheap ones, but that was because it was so easy. His fingers could move by themselves, and then his thoughts would wander, and he would make a mistake. But on a fine one, he was sure he would work carefully, and then he would go to Cuenca. "When can we begin?" he cried. "We must hurry, so that it will be made when Don Anesto returns." "Gently, Chico, gently. That is what I have been telling you. It will take a long time, many weeks, perhaps months. You must not plan to go with Don Anesto this next trip. This hat cannot be hurried." Just then, thunder crashed outside the house. The first large drops of rain spattered on the thatch roof. A flash of lightning lit up the silent Paramos, and the storm began. A solid sheet of water poured down over the house. Chico and the old man knew they would be kept indoors all day. "This is a good time to start," said the old man. "Get the new straw that Don Anesto brought, Chico." Chico ran to the corner and climbed up on the bed. From the shelf above it, he pulled down the paper-wrapped package of long straw. "We shall have to cut this straw. It is too coarse for our hat," Old Man said, and took out a small sharp knife and unrolled the package. Taking out one piece, he examined it critically. Chico watched. The old man placed his knife at the very end of the straw and made a small cut. Putting down his knife, he took hold of the two cut ends and pulled gently. The straw separated evenly. Grandfather held up the straw that had now become two fine strands instead of one coarse piece. "See?" "Let me do it, old man," Chico said eagerly. He was anxious to get to work. Grandfather moved the straw away from Chico's hands. "Not so fast. Let me see your hands first," he ordered. Chico held them out with palms, turned up and fingers widespread. "Just as I thought. Go and wash them. This straw must be kept clean, or the hat will be of no value." Chico stood up obediently, pushing the little bear, Chan, who had come to sleep on his lap, gently to the floor. Walking to the door, he dipped out a gourd full of water from the clay olla and began to rinse his hands. "Use some sand to scrub them," Grandfather called. So Chico dipped into the coarse sand that they used instead of soap and rubbed his hands back and forth. Then he rinsed them with clear water. When he went back to the fire, Grandfather was poking Chan with one bare foot to keep him away from the straw. Now that the bear was awake, he was ready to play, and the pile of straw looked as if it would be fun. Chico sneaked up behind his pet. "I will get him," he said, and grabbed the little fellow by the neck. "You are not going to spoil this hat," he said. Once when he was making a hat, Chan had got hold of it and spent all one afternoon chewing it up into tiny pieces. Chico tied the bear to the bed leg with a piece of bark and then went back to the fire. "Maybe we shall have some peace now," grumbled Grandfather, but he smiled fondly at the little animal. When the boy was seated cross-legged at the old man's feet, Grandfather handed him another knife. "Do just as I do," he said, and picked up another piece to split. "We shall cut it all before we begin weaving. In that way, we shall make no mistake and get a big piece in the hat." Chico began to split the straw carefully. His tongue stuck out between his teeth and his eyes squinted anxiously. This time he must do it correctly. When he had done a few pieces, he stopped, the knife held in mid-air, and eyed the uncut pile of straw. "It will take a long time to split all that," he said uneasily. "Not so long if you work hard," answered Grandfather. "It is impossible to make a fine hat if the straw is coarse, no matter how well you weave. Of course, if you do not want to—" He started to lay down his knife. "Oh, I was only joking, Grandfather," Chico said hastily, and grabbed up 2 straws at one time. They worked in silence. As the stack of fine strands grew larger, the other shrank. With the 2 of them working, it went quickly. Long before he came to the last piece of straw, however, Chico felt as if his back would break. He leaned back and stretched. Grandfather bent down from his stool and began to count the new straws. 10, 20, 30, he added aloud. I hope there will be enough. This kind of hat uses up a great deal. But nothing could discourage Chico. He was going to weave a fine hat and then take it to Cuenca and sell it for 50 sucres. With all that money, he could live for a long time while he searched for some trace of his people. Grandfather stood up and stretched his arms. Are we going to start the hat now, Grandfather? Chico asked eagerly. Let us have something to eat first. We must eat and sleep, even if you are going to weave a hat, replied the old man jokingly. Chico helped the old man build up the fire and make fresh coffee. From a small basket, he took out some cold boiled potatoes and a piece of the meat that Don Anesto had left. It did not take long for them to finish eating. While Chico washed his hands again, Grandfather peered out into the storm. As the rain came down and ran off the hillside, the Paramos became like a rushing river. Flashes of lightning showed the mountain peaks, leaving the moors in a purple twilight. I hope Don Anesto reached the mines safely, said the old man. How would you like to be out on the Paramos today, Chico? Chico shuddered. With the fire built up, the man and the boy were warm and snug in their little house. The roof had been newly thatched a few months before, so not one drop of water leaked through. No matter how the storm raged outside, they were safe. Grandfather picked up some straw and began the hat. Chico hung over him so that sometimes Grandfather could not see his own hands. The weaving was just the same as in the other hats. Up and over, in and out, Grandfather pulled the delicate strands. But this time, he had to be very careful. If the straw was pulled too hard, it would break. The top of the crown of the hat was no larger than a 5-cent piece when Grandfather had to stop. His old hands trembled. This was work for young fingers. His were too old and stiff. He handed the hat to the boy. You do it, he said. Weave just as you always do, but be very careful, and keep the straw pulled firmly so that the weave will be tight. The thin straw felt odd in Chico's fingers. With the other hats, there was something to hold on to, but this felt as though it would slip out of his fingers. Very slowly, he began to weave. Up and over, in and out, Grandfather pulled the delicate strands. There was silence for a time as Grandfather watched him. Once or twice he nodded. The boy had learned to weave better than he had expected. Then gradually, as Chico became more confident, his fingers moved faster. He even looked up once from his work. Grandfather shook his head. Careful now. Not so fast. If you break a straw and have to make a knot, the hat will be valued less. Chico glanced up at the old man and then slowed down. He must do as Grandfather told him on this hat. Still, he could not help letting his fingers move quickly. They seemed to know by themselves when to hold the straw firmly and when to loosen it. He had never had this feeling with the other straw hats he had woven. That had been plain, tedious work, but this was fun. He closed his eyes and felt his hands move back and forth in perfect rhythm. Grandfather leaned back and felt behind him for his pipe. The boy was doing well, very well. There was nothing for him to do but watch and make suggestions. His old hands were no good for weaving, although once upon a time, absently, he tamped tobacco into the black pipe bowl, his eyes on Chico's bent head. Just so, many, many years ago, he had worked as a young boy. He well remembered his father teaching him how to carry on the art of his family, and he had taught his daughter, Josefina, and she too had been a good weaver. Now his family was gone. Everyone was gone, even Josefina, who had left him in anger. The old man did not fool himself. He was sure that when the boy went off to Cuenca, he would go forever. Somewhere, surely, there would be a family waiting for the boy, and they would keep him. Soon old Inca, the rooster, would be his only companion. Chico stopped his flying fingers and looked up. He had come to the end of a straw. In a cheap hat, he would have stuck it in any old way or tied a knot, but not in this one. "What do I do now, viejito?" he asked. "Here, give me the knife." The old man picked up another piece of paja and held it so that Chico could see. With his pipe clamped tightly between his teeth, he tapered one end of the new straw to a point. Taking the hat from Chico, he did the same on the short piece of straw there. He held the two tapered ends together so that they fitted smoothly. "Weave that into the hat now. There will be no bump to show." Chico looked at the old man respectfully. Who would ever have believed that he knew so much about hat weaving? "That is a secret taught to our family by a weaver from Jippy Joppa," said Grandfather, sucking on his pipe and blowing out gusts of blue-gray smoke. "Jippy Joppa?" Chico glanced up quickly. "That is a town on the coast of Ecuador. It is where Panama hats were first made, long before they ever heard of them in Cuenca." "But I thought—" "Si, I know. You thought hats were made only in Cuenca. That is because you know very little. True, Cuenca makes the most hats, but the finest ones have always come from the coast where the straw grows." Chico was even more puzzled. This straw grew? He looked at the slender cream-white strands. "Tell me about it, old man," he begged. "It is a long story," Grandfather warned, smiling down at the boy. "Por favor." "Very well, but keep on working at your hat, and I will tell you how Panama hats came to Cuenca." Chico settled himself comfortably as the story began. Chapter 8. How Panama hats came to Cuenca. "First of all," Grandfather said, "these hats were woven on the hot coastland to shade the people from the strong sun. How they learned that they could make hats from a palm leaf, I do not know, but they did." "Palm?" Chico looked at the long, slender strands of white straw in his hand. "Yes, that is a palm. Paja toquilla, or straw from the toquilla palm, it is called. It grows only in the steamy lowlands, and is usually small, not over 5 feet high, with broad green leaves that open up until they are 4 feet wide. But the straw hunters do not wait until the leaf has opened. They cut it when it is tightly folded, like a... He glanced around the room for something that looked like a rolled-up leaf. "Like an umbrella," he finished, although Chico had no idea what an umbrella looked like. "It is cut and thrown into hot water. There it is kept for several days, and then it is dried in the sun. In that way it loses its green color and becomes almost white. Finally, it is cut with a knife and shaped like a comb into strips as long as the leaf. Some strips are coarse and some are very, very fine. It all depends on what type of hat they are meant for. Nowadays, most of this straw is sent to the mountains, to the towns of Cuenca, Azogues, and Biblian. But it was not always so. Once, the only weaving was done right there on the coast, and we mountain people knew nothing of straw hat making." A blast of cold, damp wind swept through the half-open door and whirled around the fire, blowing up the ashes. The fire flared. Grandfather bent over and pulled out a burning branch, then moved the pile of hat straw farther away from the sparks. Chico stopped work for a moment and looked up at the old man. He was anxious for him to go on with the story. "It was very curious, the way we learned to weave," said Grandfather, tugging at his gray-white beard. "Many years ago, at the time when Garcia Moreno was presidente, and a very good one too, there was trouble in the province of Azuay. Cuenca is the capital of the province, you know." Chico nodded. The mountain soldiers in Cuenca had a part in the uprising. Therefore, they could no longer be trusted to keep order or do what they were told. So troops were brought up from the coastal provinces and stationed in Cuenca. Chico looked puzzled. What did all these soldiers, not that he did not like to hear about them, have to do with Panama hats? Perhaps grandfather had forgotten what he started out to say and was telling a different story. Well, this revolt or trouble did not last long. They never do, grandfather said, waving his pipe. And the soldiers, who were far from their homes and families, had nothing to do. So they sent back home to the coast for hat straw and began to weave hats. That was the first time they were ever made in Cuenca, I have been told. The soldiers themselves wove hats? Chico interrupted. Si, pues, Chico laughed. He always thought of soldiers as fierce men with spears and clubs, like the Incas, but weaving hats. They could not always be fighting or marching, you know, grandfather continued. Most of the time they just sat around the barracks. They must have been cold too, coming as they had from the hot coast cities. Anyway, cold or not, they wove hats. Perhaps they wanted to earn a little extra money by their work. The boy looked down at his own hat. That was what he was going to do. But it was slow work. The straw circle had grown no more than 1/4 of an inch in all the time the old man had been talking. Did the soldiers stay in Cuenca? He asked. No, they were finally sent back. But in the meantime, the Cuencanos had learned the secret. And do you know how? Grandfather blew out a mouthful of smoke and coughed. Chico shook his head. Through the women. This was too much for Chico. Now what could the women have to do with it? The women sold fruit and cakes and little meat pies to the soldiers. When they took their goodies to the soldiers, they saw them weaving the hats. You know how curious women are, he said. They stared at the hats and then began begging to be shown what they were doing. Grandfather raised his voice to imitate the women. This is what they said. How do you do it? Where does the straw come from? How do you weave so quickly? Show me, he piped. His voice dropped back to normal. At last the men were too tired to resist longer. First, one woman learned, then another, until all the women in the town knew how to make hats. Why, those soldiers even sent to the coast for more straw for them. Of course, the women soon let out the secret to everyone in town. For a while it seemed as if all the people were going to stop raising potatoes and corn and fruit and do nothing but weave hats. Then the excitement wore off, and they began to weave only in their spare time. They found, just as you have, that it was tiring to work too long at one time. Grandfather had noticed that Chico had to stretch his back more and more often to get the kinks out. His fingers moved slowly as he grew tired. It was not for some years that buyers from foreign countries came to Cuenca to buy our hats, grandfather said. Then when hundreds of hats could be sold, even more people began to weave. Still, they did so only in their spare time. I remember, he chuckled, when a foreign buyer thought he could make the people work better and faster in a factory. So he gathered together the best weavers and put them to work in a big house. He could not understand why they could not weave. They looked so sad and worked so slowly that he sent them home. The men wanted to weave when they had finished their farming. The women needed to talk while they worked. So today, everyone works at home. And the soldiers? Chico asked. He was worried about them. What if the Cuencanos made so many hats that no one bought those from Jipijapa and the other coastal towns? The old man stood up and stretched his arms as he answered, Oh, they went right on weaving. Their people still make the best hats. The cheapest ones come from Cuenca, but the hats from Jipijapa and Monte Cristi are the most expensive. Chico looked crestfallen. What about this hat he was weaving? That was not a cheap one. The old man smiled. We have a few good weavers, as good as those on the coast. My family, as I told you, were known as fine Panama hat makers. The boy looked more cheerful. But why are they called Panama hats? You did not tell me that. because they were first sold in Panama, a country far to the north of us. But they are not made there. Really, they should be called Ecuadorian hats. The old man picked up his grey wool poncho and walked toward the door. That is enough story for now, Chico. See, the storm has gone. Put up your hat and run on outdoors. We need some water and more ichu grass to dry for the fire. But if I do not work on the hat, if you work too much, it will not be good. No, that is enough for one day. There is plenty of time, even before Don Anesto returns. You are weaving quickly. Tomorrow you may weave again. And the old man, followed by Chico and the bear, walked out into the freshly washed Paramos, where the golden sunlight flashed from the mountain tops. Chapter 9. In the Potato Field. And so Chico wove his hat. During the many weeks that followed, there were storms that lashed the little stone hut on the lonely Paramos, and there were days of golden sunlight when not even the mist fell until late at night. And Chico was content. In his happiness at working on the hat and his love for the Paramos, he almost forgot Cuenca. Almost, but not quite. Then there came a day when the hat was nearly finished. There was nothing to do but tie off the brim and trim the straw. Then it would be done. Even grandfather said it was a good hat. But still, Don Anesto, the arriero, had not returned from the mines. One morning, Chico awakened early with Chan's wet, rough tongue licking his cheek. Sleepily, he turned under his red poncho and looked toward the fire. Old Man knelt there, blowing on the coals. With each breath, his wrinkled old cheeks blew out until they were as smooth as Chico's own. Then, as he puffed, the skin collapsed like a burst fruit. Chico watched and tried not to laugh. It was always so hard for grandfather to blow up the fire. At the noise, the old man looked up. His eyes were watery from the smoke. "Caramba!" he exclaimed. "This wood is too wet. It will never burn." Chico jumped out of his warm bed and pulled his trousers and shirt around him. "Let me do it, viejito," he said. "It will burn no better for you," grumbled the old man, but he moved aside and made room for the boy. Chico knelt down and crisscrossed the wood. Gently, he pushed the hot coals underneath it and threw on a few pieces of dry grass. Then he filled his cheeks with air and puffed. The wood burst into flames. He glanced at the old man out of the corner of his brown eye. "And why not? The wood was hot by the time you got to it." But grandfather smiled, even though he spoke severely. While grandfather put on the clay pot of water for coffee, Chico glanced outdoors. It was still dark. What was grandfather doing up so early? He yawned and shivered in the morning cold. The little fire blazed, and in a few minutes the water bubbled, boiled, and sizzled over the edge. Grandfather lifted the pot off with a corn husk. While Chico held the cloth sack half filled with fine black coffee, the old man poured hot water through it. The dark brown liquid ran through into another pot. From this each filled his own gourd and settled down to drink. Chico reached up and pulled down the brown sugar cake. He added a few slivers to his own and gave some to Chan. Chico did not try to talk. He knew that grandfather was not happy until he had had his morning coffee, and as he said, taken some of the chill out of his old bones. As usual, Chan was bent on getting into mischief. This morning he discovered the coffee pot and tried to climb into it. Each time he stuck his nose over the edge, the hot steam would burn him, and he would fall backward. Chico put his hand over his mouth to keep from laughing. Even grandfather had to chuckle. A ray of sunshine broke through the morning mist and fell in a thin streak across the earthen floor. The day had come. Grandfather set down his cup and slapped his leg. "Come on, Chico. We are going to work in the potato field today. I have a feeling in my bones that Don Anesto will come soon, and the potatoes must be ready to send down with him. Chico jumped up, spilling some of his coffee on one foot. He grabbed the burned foot and hopped around with it in his hand. "Do you think he will come? When? Tomorrow?" He had almost forgotten that Don Anesto was ever coming. "I do not know when, but I think it will be soon. Anyway, the potatoes should have been dug a week ago." The old man picked up a hoe, put it over his shoulder, and started toward the field. Chico hopped along behind with Chan following him. At the field, the old man stopped. The green leaves and purple flowers of the potato plants were gone now. Only the leafless stems remained. It was time to pull them out, harvest the potatoes, and plant a new crop. "You start down at the far end of the field, Chico, and work toward me," he said. The boy nodded and walked to the other end of the potato patch. Bending over, he loosened the soil around the plant with his hoe. Then, grasping the plant, he pulled it up and all the little potatoes with it. He went on to the next one. As he worked, digging into the soft earth for any potatoes that remained buried, Chan dug too. He made the dirt fly until he caught a shiny black beetle for his breakfast. Walking away proudly, he lay down to eat, watching the boy as though he thought he would try to take this fine morsel away from him. Chico laughed and went on working. And Grandfather was the first to reach the center of the field. He straightened up to ease his back and said, as he looked back at the mounds of shining yellow potatoes, "We have a good crop this year to send to Cuenca. That is, we will if you hurry up." Chico dug his hoe deep into the earth. In a few moments, he, too, came to the center of the field. "Ah-ya!" He dropped his hoe and stood up straight. "That is hard work. When I get through here, I shall never want to see another potato." "You will not say that by dinner time," answered the old man, his eyes twinkling. Chico laughed, for he knew he would be glad to eat hot boiled potatoes by then. Once more the two bent over and began to work. This time they walked away from each other, down the long row. On the next row, they moved toward the center again. Chico worked more quickly now, for Chan had wandered away. He had found a new plaything. Among the young potatoes in the other field, the little bear dug busily until Grandfather saw him. "Go on! Get away from there! Leave those plants alone!" the old man shouted and waved his hoe. Chan sat back on his haunches and watched the old man with bright black eyes. Then, as soon as he saw he was not watched, he got busy again. When the field was half done, Grandfather threw down his hoe. "Ay-ya! I am tired," he said, rubbing his hands together. "And besides, this is enough cargo for one trip. Let us rest." Chico was glad to follow the old man away from the field. He threw himself down on the short, crisp moss of the paramos and leaned back against a rock. Chan ran up and began to crawl over him. Chico pushed him away and lay back so that he could look at the deep blue sky. A black speck wheeled high overhead. While Chico watched, it grew larger and larger, circling over the mountains. The boy raised his arm. There was the old condor. Every day it flew over the paramos looking for food. Once it had come so low, when Chico was out with Chan, that he had seen its red neck with the white collar of feathers around it and the strong, curved beak. Chan had whined with fear, but Chico had not been frightened. The giant condor was like an old friend, a part of the paramos, but Chico's thoughts were far from the paramos. Glancing at the old man who sat with half-closed eyes in the sun, he said, "Viejito, what is it like in Cuenca? Were you ever there?" Grandfather made a grumpy noise in his throat and answered, "Of course I have been there." "Do you think I have always lived in the mountains?" "What is it like?" Chico repeated. "It is a city, like any other," said the old man, "with a great many houses. Then, in the center of the town, There is a great plaza with flowers and statues, and around it are many buildings and the great cathedral. The streets are always full of people, pushing each other around and rushing to get somewhere. It's not like here, where we have all the room we need. Chico leaned toward the old man excitedly, his brown eyes shining. To think he would see all that. What do the people do? So many of them. What do they eat there? He asked. Oh, they sell hats and bring in vegetables from their farms to the market. And some of them have stores where they sell cloth and shoes and tools. Everyone does something different. And the food. The old man paused and ran his tongue over his lips. There are all kinds of food. On market days, the women set up little kitchens right on the street. As you walk along, you can smell pork frying, chicken roasting, and spiced rice boiling. Then there are trays of sweet cakes and fruit. Oh, the food is good, that I will say. Won't we have a fine time, Chan, in Cuenca? Chico asked happily, pulling the bear close to him. Think of all the things we shall see. Well, you have not gone yet. And there is work to be done, said the old man. He lifted himself up from the ground. Grandfather sounded angry, but it was only because he was unhappy. When he thought of Chico going away, a lump came into his throat. The two walked toward the field again. Chico chattered all the way. They had just picked up their hoes and started digging when the old man threw up his head, listening. What? Grandfather held up a finger to silence the boy. Chico turned his head to one side and listened. From the trail that led over the hill and past the house came a faint noise. Chico's heart began to pound. Throwing down the hoe, he started to run toward the house. At the corner, he looked for a moment and then turned back toward the old man. It is, old man. It's Don Anesto. I can see him coming up the hill. Chico jumped up and down with excitement. The old man, shaking his head sadly, followed the boy and stared down the trail. Yes, Don Anesto had arrived, and his boy, his Chico, whom he loved so dearly, would leave him. Chapter 10. Chico goes to Cuenca. Don Ernesto's kindly, weather-beaten face beamed when he saw Chico. Hola! He called. So you got back safely? The condors did not get you after all. Then, more seriously, he spoke to the old man. I worried about the boy after he left me. There was such a storm that night. Chico opened his mouth, his eyes dancing, to tell Don Anesto all that had happened since he last saw him. But Grandfather interrupted. Wait until Don Anesto has some coffee, boy. Where are your manners? And take the cargo off the mules. Chico ran quickly to the animals. No, Chico, leave them, called Don Anesto. He turned toward the old man. I am not staying the night this time. I must go at once. I am weeks late now, but I shall have some coffee. Muchas gracias. Don Anesto moved toward the little hut, pulling his red poncho off over his head as he talked. Chico stood still, too stunned to move. He barely heard the muleteer grumbling about the bad weather, the worn trails, and the sick mules that had held him up so long. If Don Anesto was going right away, then he, Chico, could not go. Automatically, Chico threw a few handfuls of dry grass to the mules. Then he went into the dark house. Grandfather was already telling Don Anesto all that had happened on the Paramos. Don Anesto sucked in his breath in astonishment. When the old man had finished, he stared at the boy before he spoke. And you found nothing, Joven? Just as I said? His words tumbling one after another, Chico told of the prayer book. When he lifted it out of the chest, Don Anesto turned it over and over, examining it and reading the writing. He nodded his head thoughtfully. See. Yes, possible, he murmured. It may have belonged to your mother. But what now, little one? Are you content now? Chico drew a long breath and made ready to tell Don Anesto what he had planned. Grandfather waved a hand for him to be quiet. There was silence while Grandfather sucked on his pipe, and Don Ernesto drank his hot black coffee, sweetened with a little brown sugar. Then, suddenly, the old man said, "Don Ernesto, the boy wants to go to Cuenca with you. There, he feels, he will find something about his mother and father and where they came from." The arriero looked startled. He glanced at Chico's young face, shining with hope, and the eager, bright eyes, and from that to Grandfather's wrinkled, sad old face. "Cuenca!" he exclaimed. "What would he live on?" "Old man," he turned toward Grandfather accusingly, "you know as well as I do how much it costs to live in Cuenca. I would take care of him gladly, you know that, if I could. But with all those mouths to feed, it is all I can do to keep from starving." "Sigh, Don Ernesto," Grandfather said. "I know, but you will not have to take care of Chico. He has a hat to sell." "A hat!" Don Ernesto looked at the old man to see if he was joking. "And how long will that keep him?" "Perhaps a week." Chico's heart sank. For the moment, Grandfather forgot that he did not want the boy to leave him. With flashing eyes, he said, "This hat will bring 50 sucres, enough to feed the boy for a long time." Don Ernesto looked at him as if he thought the old man was crazy. 50 sucres! It will if he has a gold nugget wrapped up in it." He laughed scornfully. Grandfather said no more. Chico crawled up on the bed and took down his bundle. Walking toward the fire where the men sat, he held it out. "You show him, Chico," directed Grandfather. The boy unrolled the cloth carefully and with a flip of his hand opened up the hat. It was almost finished. The brim was not yet tied, and a fringe of long straw hung down. Otherwise, it was done. Silently, he showed it to Don Ernesto. The arriero stared. After wiping his hands on his trousers, he took it between 2 fingers. Without a word, he turned it around and looked inside. Chico watched him proudly. It was a fine hat. Even he knew that. The light, thin straw was tightly woven, and not a bump or knot marred it. "Whew, Bayou!" Don Ernesto whistled. Chico looked at him in surprise. "This is a fine hat. A beautiful hat," he exclaimed. "I told you it was," answered the old man. "This is almost as good as a Monte Cristi." Don Ernesto could not seem to get over his surprise. He looked from one to the other. "Do not tell me the boy wove this. You must have, old man, even if your fingers are stiff." Chico was hurt. After all the weeks of hard work he had put on the hat, now Don Ernesto did not think he had made it. "Of course he made it, Don Ernesto. You know these hands of mine can hardly weave the cheap ones, let alone one like that. I showed him how, yes, but the boy seems to have a knack for it." "Sigh, that is it," said Don Ernesto as if to himself. "He has a knack. It is a knack only a few have. You know that, viejo. Surely the boy must come from—" "Not now, Ernesto," broke in Grandfather. "I have thought of it too. We shall talk of it some other time. Now, will you take the boy to Cuenca? He will never be happy until he finds out who he is." Don Ernesto looked thoughtful. Outside, the mules stamped their small hooves restlessly. "Yes," he exclaimed finally, "I'll take him. Somewhere there must be word of his family. It is better that he find out." Chico was so surprised that he did not move. He watched Grandfather. The old man's face lit up happily at first, then it grew sad. "Well, do not stand there, boy," said Don Ernesto. "Get your things. We leave in a few minutes, for we must cross the Paramos before dark." Don Ernesto and Grandfather filled the sacks with newly dug potatoes and tied them on the mules. Chico ran around like a wild thing, hunting his other trousers and his new sandals. He did not forget his mother's shawl. He wrapped his fine hat and the precious prayer book in it, and tied them all up in another cloth. Chico was waiting when the men came back from the potato field. He had his straw hat on, his poncho thrown over his shoulder, and his bundle gripped in one hand. He was ready to go. Then, as he saw Grandfather plodding along, his old head bent forward, he realized for the first time that he was leaving him. In all his dreams of going to Cuenca, he had not thought about leaving Grandfather. He swallowed hard. Perhaps he did not want to go after all. Perhaps he did not want to leave the Paramos with its strong sunshine and grey mists, and the towering peaks, and the condor which circled overhead each day, and especially Grandfather. Don Anesto started the mules down the trail. "Come on, Joven, we do not have all week," he called. Then Chan ran out and stood on his hind legs, pawing the boy's legs. "Caramba, I almost forgot you," Chico exclaimed, forgetting his sadness. Leaning down, he scooped up the little bear and held him under his free arm. Chan wiggled and licked his neck with his rough little tongue. "Come!" Don Anesto half turned around to call the boy and then stopped. "What are you doing with that thing?" he exclaimed. "What?" Chico looked behind to see what Don Anesto was talking about. "The bear, Chan! Put him down and come along!" The arriero shouted impatiently. "Leave Chan? But he is going to Cuenca with me," said Chico in bewilderment. "Oh no, my boy," Don Anesto said firmly. "We will have enough to worry about without having Chan." "Don Anesto is right, Chico," Grandfather said. "Chan would only be unhappy in the city. The dogs would bother him day and night. Leave him to keep me company." Unhappily, Chico handed the struggling bear to the old man. Don Anesto started off down the hill, taking long strides to catch up with the plodding mules. "You must hurry, my boy," said Grandfather. Without a word, the boy took off his hat and stood in front of the old man with bowed head. The old man lifted a trembling hand and touched his head with 2 fingers, blessing him. "Be a good boy, Chico. Remember what I have taught you. Do just as Don Anesto tells you always. May you find that which you seek. If ever you want, come back to me, for here is always your home." Tears came to Chico's eyes as he listened to the kind, soft, old voice. "Vamos!" Don Anesto's voice called from far down the trail. "Adios, old man," Chico said haltingly, and turned away to run after the mules as fast as he could. "Vaya con Dios, my son! Go with God!" called the old man after him. At the last turn, before the trail dropped down the hillside, Chico looked back. Through his tears, he could barely see the old man, with Chan in his arms, standing before the grey stone house. He waved. Then they rounded a turn, and Grandfather and the house and Chan were out of sight. Chico was on his way to Cuenca.